What makes a society civilized? Anthropologists and archaeologists have been asking that question for a long time. We have prehistory and prehistoric societies where we have a lot of artifacts from those societies, but are they civilized? Archaeologists and anthropologists eventually came up with a list of 6 things that create a civilized society. Those are urban life, system of government, distinct social classes, tools and specialized skills, written communication, and religious beliefs. So in our ancient societies, we're going to look for these things and talk about them and see, really, is this what makes a society civilized? Do we agree or disagree with this point? The Paleolithic period is also called the Old Stone Age, and it's from the beginning of time, whenever you think that beginning was, up until about 8000 BC. The people at that time were not organized into cities, towns, the urban life that's part of a civilized society. Everyone lived distinct from one another, and they were just trying to survive. It was a hunting and gathering society. Artifacts have shown us that there was a lot of importance of women, and it's interesting that we find art from this time period. So there was more than just surviving. They really cared about expressing themselves in some form or fashion. And then as we move to the Neolithic period, that's when the cities began forming. Um, Life was more stable and predictable during this time period. They started herding cows and sheep and goats for their food, so domestication of animals, and they started gardens. They started gardening so that they could grow their own food. So life a little more stable during this time period, and so there's more art that we'll talk about during this time period. And then during the Bronze Age, we see a need for wars. Wars start during the end of the Neolithic period, but as people are settling together, accumulating wealth, then people want what someone else has, so the wars start. And that's when we move into the Bronze Age, and metal, which is better used in warfare than stone. Metal replaces stone in the tools and the weapons. And then a lot of the large-scale architecture, like the ziggurats in Sumer, the pyramids in Egypt. And then finally, as we get to the Iron Age, then we see whole kingdoms and civilizations at war, not just small tribes, but whole kingdoms at war with one another. And it's interesting that much of what archaeology has shown us that we have from the earliest civilizations is lost during this time period. It's just wiped off the face of the earth as if it never existed. And it was only during the 18th and 19th centuries that many of these earlier civilizations were rediscovered. This painting is on the walls of a cave called the Lascaux Caves in France and dates back to about 15,000 years ago during the Paleolithic period. It was a hunting and gathering society, so they had to go out and hunt for their food. And so here we have a bison. Perhaps this was before the bison hunt, or perhaps when they got back from the hunt to celebrate its success. But in any case, it shows the self-expression that the people had even when they had to look for food in their everyday life. The halls of this cave are covered in paintings such as this. We have all sorts of animals that are depicted that were very important to the life at that time, and many of them show a hunt such as this one. So it just points to the importance of art, even to the caveman, we would call him, to a prehistoric society. This is another painting from the Lascaux Caves. This one is called the Great Hall of the Bulls, and you can see why. You see the examples of all the different animals, and this would be as you are standing on the ground and looking up. That's where you would see all of this. It is really quite amazing. It's in France, and you used to go and visit this place, but mankind's erosion plus mankind and pollution, all that he had done to it, they had to close them down, and they have built an exact replica of the Lascaux Caves nearby where you can now go and see what it looked like when the cavemen actually did these paintings. This is another example of one of the paintings from the Lascaux Caves, and you can see the walkway at the bottom of the picture, and you can see as you walk through, and it's really quite amazing. Also, the way they use the walls of the cave to position the animals, like it might be the hump on the back of an animal, or it might be the horn of an animal. And of course, they had to use natural elements like berries and any kind of plants to use for their different colors with the animals. This is the last example from the Lascaux Caves. This one's called the Painted Gallery, and you see 4 different animals depicted, probably the 4 that were most important to their society. This is also from the Paleolithic period. This little statuette that was found by archaeologists dates all the way back to about 28,000 BC, called the Venus of Willendorf. Venus, because Venus was the goddess of love in ancient Roman society, and then Willendorf is the city where she was found. Note the enlarged genitalia, and that represents the importance of women to the society. Women, of course, were the ones who had the children. They had the life-bearing qualities. And so ancient civilizations were very much in awe of that power that women had to give birth. But another negative component is to see that there is no face on our statue. While women did give birth, note that there's no distinguishing characteristics. All that a woman was noted for was the fact that she could have children. So you've got to have a mixed bag here with what the statue of the Venus of Willendorf means. Civilization is said to have begun in the area called ancient Mesopotamia. This area is where the Tigris and Euphrates rivers come together. It's also called the Fertile Crescent because there was fertile soil, there was water, so it was a good place for people to live. This area is divided into 2 different areas, the Sumer and the Semitic area, called the Sumerian period and then the Semitic period. In the Sumerian period, you see the dates here on the slide. This is in Sumer, which also this is in the Middle East. So we are here in Iraq, and this is very important for many reasons. One reason is because this is where the invention of writing took place. We had, first of all, the pictographs, which were pictures like a stick man, and then we had hieroglyphics, which combined pictures plus symbols like our letters that stood for something, and then eventually we had cuneiform. Cuneiform was developed at Uruk, which was the capital of Sumer, and is important as we get to the Epic of Gilgamesh. You'll hear more about the city of Uruk and the king of Uruk, Gilgamesh. But because writing began here, it's such an important area in the development of civilization. In this area, the most important part of life was the temple. They worshiped many different gods. It was a polytheistic society. Polytheistic means many gods, and there was a temple to these gods. So life circled around the temple, and oftentimes they were built on the ziggurats, which is a tall, flat structure that was important for this particular civilization. So, and as part of their celebrations of the gods, they also had the New Year's festival, which occurred not in January, but at the planting of a new year in the spring. And so that was a renewal of the gods, a renewal of the earth, and was very important for their societies. The Semitic period follows the Sumerian period, and the name comes from Shem, one of the sons of Noah, and includes the Jewish people, though we also have the Babylonians and the Akkadians who are part of the Semites. You see the first word here is ziggurats, and I mentioned this with the Sumerian period. The ziggurats began with the Sumerians and continued into the Semitic period. A ziggurat is a platform about 40 feet high whose corners are oriented towards the compass points. Now, the famous ziggurat of the Sumerian period is of the White Temple, and the White Temple at Uruk. And that particular ziggurat was extremely large. Here you see an example of it. And what you see in Genesis of the Bible is an even larger ziggurat, which you may have heard before, called the Tower of Babylon. Hammurabi was the king of Babylon. And he is important because he developed a law code, which is one of the qualities of a civilized society, and that will be on the next slide. But the Semitic period just followed through and really went further with some of the ideas that began during the Sumerian period, including law and language and the development of these civilized cities. Two such cities were Nimrud and Nineveh. These were two important cities during the Semitic period. This slide is a stele of Hammurabi's law code. A stele is an upright slab that's made of stone that has text on it and oftentimes has sculpture on it, as we see on this one. And it oftentimes served as a grave marker or a commemorative monument. Here, this monument recognizes the law code that Hammurabi, the Babylonian king, that he wrote and that governed his people. What you see at the top of the stele is the sun god giving the law to Hammurabi so that he gives it then to the people. This is the first example that we have of any law given to a group of people, and it's the earliest attempt to achieve social justice by legislation. We now move from ancient Mesopotamia to ancient Egypt. This particular slide covers the four different time periods of ancient Egypt. As you see there, the Old Kingdom, the Middle Kingdom, the New Kingdom, and the Late Period. Notice that this is the same time period of the Semitic period, so we have parallel civilizations with the Semitic peoples and with the Egyptians. Notice also that ancient Egypt is called the Gift of the Nile. Just like we have the Sumer and Semitic peoples who developed because of the conflagration of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. Here in Egypt, the civilization develops because of the Nile River. Ancient Egypt is called the Gift of the Nile. The civilization could not have flourished if it had not been for the Nile River that flooded the area and they were able to grow food. So that's very important. Now, the ancient Egyptians, they were known for their unity and consistency in all things. They did not change much. Even though we have these four different time periods, they really didn't change. So the Egyptians had a very strong central government. They had a pharaoh who acted as their living god. Their religion is extremely important to them. The Egyptians are henotheistic, H-E-N-O, henotheistic, which means they have several gods, but there is one God who is the most important, and that one God is the sun god, called Aton-Ra. More on him later. Also, Isis and Osiris were important in the funeral rites of the Egyptians. You may have heard how important the burial rites of the Egyptians were, because the Book of the Dead was a main religious text for them. Extremely important that they buried their people well so that they would have a good afterlife. And the pyramids are part of that burial. There was not a whole lot of opportunity for artists during this time period to express themselves because all art was done to honor the pharaoh. So everything will be about either the pharaoh or about the burial ceremonies. The Old and Middle Kingdoms of ancient Egypt are characterized by pyramids. And so everything you see on this slide has to do with the great pyramids that were built. The pyramids were built to house the bodies of the pharaohs when they died. They were very elaborate burial sites for the pharaohs. And of course, you know, the pharaohs were mummified and all that you probably have learned before about how Egyptian pharaohs were buried. And these huge pyramids were built to mark that, and they had a lot of mazes and details to get to the pharaoh, hopefully so that people would not get there, because he was buried with all of his jewels, all of his wealth, and oftentimes his wife, his children, any special slaves would have been buried there along with him. Now, how these pyramids were built is still a question. Some say that there were slaves who built them and they were, you know, forced to do so. Others say that it was farmers during their off-season who built it. But nevertheless, they did use the stone that they would convey up the Nile River, and and then they would build like rafts made out of wood, of logs that they would have to pull to the site and build these incredible pyramids, without benefit of anything mechanical or electric, and to these precise proportions. So they are very amazing. Imhotep is known as the first architect of the pyramids, and he built for King Zoser, and he was later deified. The next slide will show an example of a pyramid built by Imhotep. The Great Pyramids at Giza, there are 3 of them, and these are the most famous of the pyramids. Presumably they align with the stars, and hopefully some of you will choose to do one of your research presentations on the pyramids, because there is so much more information out there than what I am giving you today. One of those pyramids at Giza has a great sphinx built in front of it. The sphinx this will be in a slide that is coming up, with the head of a man, the body of a lion, and presumably it was to guard the pyramid and to keep it safe. And that still is important. It's still there today. This slide is an example of the step pyramid, and you see why it's called step. That was built by Imhotep at Saqqara, Egypt. And the construction is very elaborate. The stone was quarried and ferried across the Nile during the flood season, and it took them 10 years to build the ramps that they would pull the stone out of the river with, and another 20 years to build the pyramid itself. So this was a long, intensive process, and they just got better, as you'll see in the next example of the pyramids. This slide is an example of the smooth pyramid at Giza with the Great Sphinx. There is a picture on page 23 in your textbook of all 3 pyramids at Giza, which were built for 3 different pharaohs. And Giza is spelled G-I-Z-A on my slide and G-I-Z-E-H in your book, because no one really knows how to spell the ancient Egyptian words. So this one has the Great Sphinx in front of it, and the Great Sphinx was important later on to the Greeks. We will see it in some of our Greek works. And also on the side of these pyramids, they had boats that were there to take the deceased to a successful afterlife. As I mentioned earlier, within the pyramids you have great wealth. There was great examples of artwork and of statues and of jewels and just wealth throughout that was hidden, but also on the walls of the pyramid you did have these great scenes that had been painted for the pharaoh. And this is an example of one such scene called the funerary scene that tells what the Egyptians believed happened when a person died. You will notice in this scene the panel of 14 judges at the top, and those are there to make an accounting of the deceased deeds during his life and to appear before the judge. The deceased person is being led to the scales by the jackal god Anubis. You see that the jackal god is leading him to those scales, and on the scale the deceased person's heart will be weighed against a feather, the feather of Mot, who is the goddess of truth and justice. And if the feather weighs more, then the person has a good afterlife. If his heart weighs more, then it's a bad heart and he has a bad afterlife. The God of wisdom is standing to the right of the scale, and that is Thoth, and he is holding a scroll in his hand so that he can record the outcome of the scales. The Lord of the underworld is sitting to the throne on the right, and that is Osiris. And Osiris is the ultimate judge here of what happens on the scales. The symbol of immortality is held in Anubis' hands, and it is the Ankh, the Ankh, the key of life, and it's in the hands of both Anubis and Horus. And so this kind of encapsulates what the Egyptians believe about death and immortality. The Rosetta Stone is the key to unlocking the secrets of ancient Egyptian writing. We would not have known what all I have just talked about had it not been for the Rosetta Stone, because much of ancient Egyptian culture was demolished and destroyed. The Rosetta Stone was discovered in 1799 by a Frenchman in the city of Rosetta by French soldiers who were rebuilding a fort in Egypt. On the writing of this stone, we have hieroglyphic on the top, Demotic in the middle, which is a combination of hieroglyphic and ancient Egyptian with some Greek, and on the bottom we have Greek. So the same message is conveyed in 3 different languages. And so once the Greek was deciphered, then the other 2 could be translated and we could learn a lot about Egyptian culture. The French scholar who was responsible for the translation of the Rosetta Stone was Jean-François Champollion, and because of him we know so much about ancient Egyptian culture. Here we see detail of hieroglyphic and Demotic script on the Rosetta Stone. Now we usher in the new kingdom of the ancient Egyptian culture, and the man who ushered this in was Amenhotep, who changed his name to Akhenaten because he wanted to emphasize Aten, the sun god. And while it still was a henotheistic society, there was more emphasis put on the sun god during Akhenaten's reign. So that was a big change in a society that liked to stay stable and consistent. What Akhenaten also did was that he changed their art. Their art had always been very stiff and formal, and it showed the pharaohs in a very authoritative pose. What Akhenaten did, he had some artwork done of himself and his family that was very light and airy and showed the family in a very domestic scene with their children playing around them, with the sun shining down on them. You can see this on page 30 in your textbook. And his queen was Queen Nefertiti, who is one of the most famous Egyptian queens ever. This slide is of Akhenaten's queen, Queen Nefertiti. You see how graceful and elegant she appears, and to have a sculpture done of a woman was pretty much unheard of during that time period as well. But you can see how wealthy she appears. You can see the jewels. You can see her eye makeup, which is typical of what we think of when we think of ancient Egypt. And this was done about 1360 BC. What is interesting is that one of their sons, King Tut, as soon as he became pharaoh, then he did away with all of Akhenaten's reforms and went back to the way things used to be in Egypt. This is the gold mask of King Tut. As mentioned previously, King Tut led the opposition to Akhenaten because the Egyptians don't like change. So as soon as he became pharaoh, he changed everything back from the way his father had done it. And King Tut is remembered for several reasons. You probably heard of the ancient treasures of King Tut that really circulates now and travels across the world for people to view, because his treasures were not discovered until 1923 by Howard Carter in the Valley of the Kings, the area where the pharaohs were buried, and still things are being discovered there today. And there's a picture in your book on page 31 of the treasures that were discovered, and of course this is the funerary mass that would have been placed there on the tomb, and very popular as well because of the circumstances surrounding King Tut's death. It appeared that he was a child and he died of some sort of leg fracture. They're not exactly sure, but he was young, as evidenced by how small his mummy was. And there's just a lot of interest surrounding King Tut. Now we move to our third major culture during prehistoric times. This is the Aegean culture, and these cultures are all situated around the Aegean Sea, which is that sea in between modern-day Greece and Turkey. And we have the Cycladic Islands, which today those islands are very popular in movies. Santorini you may have heard of. And then the mainland Greece, which is the Mycenaeans. That is the mainland Greece that we're talking about. And then the Minoans, who are on the island of Crete, which is in the southern area, in the ocean south of Greece. What is interesting about all three of these cultures is that they vanished. They flourished for a while and then they completely vanished and were not rediscovered until the 20th century. This slide shows us one of the few statues that is left from the Cycladic Islands. Not much is known about the life on the Cycladic Islands during prehistoric times. There are no written records of any kind, but they have discovered these little statues that are from as small as 3 inches to as large as 6 feet that have been discovered on the islands, and obviously they show the importance of the female. Very different from the Venus of Willendorf, but still we do have a woman depicted here. You can tell from the genitalia, and again, no face. So, women were important in the fact that they could give life, but not so important as to be distinguished from other women. The palace of Manos, who is the king of Crete, was at Knossos, which is the capital of Crete. So Manos, this goes into a lot of Greek mythology, but let me just hit on the high points here. That Manos was the result of a union between Zeus and Europa. So he's a demigod. He's the son of a god. He was married to Pasiphae, and Pasiphae had a union with a bull, and the result of that union was the Minotaur. And so the Minotaur plays into a lot of Greek mythology. The Minotaur is half man, half bull, and to protect the Minotaur and to protect his wife, King Minos had a labyrinth, which is just an elaborate maze built in his palace so that it would be difficult for people to find the Minotaur. Well, part of what the Minotaur had to have every year as part of his yearly sacrifice was 7 Athenian boys and 7 Athenian girls who were sacrificed to him. And of course, he ate them. So the people of Athens did not like this, and so they kept sending heroes to try to kill the Minotaur, and no one was able to do it until Theseus killed the Minotaur with the help of the daughter of Minos. And actually, when Theseus killed the Minotaur, that is the beginning of Greek music and Greek dance, which we will talk about in chapter 2. So that's quite a bit of mythology involved with the palace at Knossos. And in the palace itself, we have some elaborate wall paintings that use just beautiful colors that, again, of course, had to be drawn from nature. And so that is the importance of this culture to us. Here we see part of the ruins of the Palace of Knossos at Crete, and what is so interesting here is that this palace was constructed to let in as much light as possible. If you'll notice, the columns are larger at the top than they are at the bottom, and this creates light wells so that more light is able to get into the building. And then having that exterior with all the columns, that protects what we see inside with the stonework, with some of the frescoes, which is just a painting that's done on a wall. So we'll see that in a couple of slides. Here we have a better picture of those light wells. You can see, because you can see where the columns have been cut off. And this is just another view of the palace at Knossos. Here we see the throne room of King Minos. The throne itself, not very impressive. You see that small stone throne. But behind it, look at that mural. Look at those colors. Look how rich the reds and the golds and the blues. The Minoans really did love color and they love nature. And so you can see that in this mural. We have a griffin here that is a beast that has the body of a lion and the head of a bird. And then we have the flowers that they love that. We have the straight lines, which is amazing that they could do that. So it's just a great example of prehistoric art. This statue that was discovered on the island of Crete is also called the Mistress of the Beast, and you can see why, with a snake in each hand and a cat on her head. And she has on the priest garment. The apron that she has on shows that she was a priestess in one of the temples there. Of course, this is a polytheistic society, the ancient Greek gods and goddesses. And so she would have been a priestess in the temple of one of the gods or goddesses. Zeus comes to mind. And again, we see the importance of women and their connection with fertility. And she would have been called a mother goddess. So Minoan culture dominated the Aegean culture from 1400 to 1200 BC. And at that time, the Mycenaeans came in and completely just wiped out the Minoans. Remember, the Mycenaeans are on mainland Greece, and the Minoans are on the island of Crete. On Crete, they had not built up any walls. They had nothing to withstand the enemy because they thought they were an island, and so they would have been protected. But the Mycenaeans got there and completely wiped them out. And then the Mycenaean culture flourished for some time. And then they were eventually wiped out. We're not sure why. Could have been a natural disaster, could have been an enemy who came in and wiped them out, but they were wiped out. And you probably have all heard of the ancient Greeks. You probably know about the Greek gods and goddesses. You have read the Iliad and the Odyssey, but you may not have realized that we would not know about any of that if it were not for a man named Heinrich Schliemann, a German who made it his life's mission to uncover what he thought would still be there in Troy and in Greece. So he made a lot of money, and with that money, he started excavations because he felt sure after reading the Iliad and the Odyssey that these cities would still be there. So first of all, he discovered the remains of Troy, which is under modern-day Ilium. And Troy was the enemy of the Greeks. In the Iliad, we see the great battle between Troy and Greece, the Trojan War, you may have heard of. And so first of all, he started looking there for the city of Troy, and he found it. And then after that, he said, well, if Troy is here, then let me go to where I think might have been the Greece that was depicted in the Iliad and the Odyssey and start excavating there. And so he did, and he discovered the Mycenaean civilization at what he thought was the same time period of Agamemnon, who is the king of Greece that we see in the Iliad. Further research did prove that it was an earlier civilization from Agamemnon, but it in no way lessens the impact of Schliemann's discovery that these were two ancient cities that were very cultured, very developed, and then they were just wiped out later on. Here we have an example of architecture from the ancient Mycenaean civilization. Here we have the Lion Gate, and of course you can see the lions above the gate itself. You know, and think about the fact that they're building this gate with absolutely no mechanical or electrical help. And I should mention that the Mycenaean civilization is on the Peloponnesus, which is at the peninsula in the southern area of Greece. And later we'll be talking about the Peloponnesian War, and it was named after this area called the Peloponnesus. Here we have the treasury of Atreus, which was the burial place of King Atreus. They buried their people in these huge structures, and this is 43 feet high with a narrow passageway leading to the tomb itself, and then all the other treasures would be buried with them like the Egyptians did as well. But then this whole mound would be covered over, and so it looked like just a small hill, and people hopefully would not come and raid it. The technique that is used here is called corbelling, and that is where we have the stones that are cut in the rows that you see across, but then they are beveled, cut at an angle so that they will form this dome. This dome-like structure is called a tholos, T-H-O-L-O-S, and we will see that again when we get into chapters 2 and 3 with the Greeks and Romans. And so know that term now, tholos, but it is simply a rounded structure. This is more of a beehive type structure that was used to bury the kings of Mycenae. This mask was found at Mycenae and just tells us how rich the culture was. I mean, rich in culture, but also rich in material goods, that it is made of beaten gold and would have been placed over the figure that was buried. Originally, they thought that this mask might have been Agamemnon's, but further research showed that it was not. But it does show us quite a bit about the Mycenaean culture.